Good morning. First Sunday in January 1995 was my first sermon with this congregation as full-time preacher here. And Amanda and I thought that probably we would be here for about 3 years and then move back closer to our family. I don't think we realized that you would become our family. And so 30 years ago was my first association with this group as working with you regularly. And I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful for the encouragement that you've been to us. And what a pleasure you've made the last 30 years of my life. How many people can say that? And so very, very grateful. Very, very grateful for that. Thankful. Before we get into the lesson, there's one other thing that I want to mention. I want to commend and thank the teen class that made the trip over to Athens yesterday for the youth study that was at the East Side congregation in Athens. I was one of the speakers and did not feel like I connected real well and did a very good job. And the ones from this congregation were very supportive of me during the lesson and trying to help me out. And I appreciate that. And I'm very thankful for that. And I think that those type of activities, those kind of events are good for us to attend. I think it's good for the young people to attend because I think it gives them an opportunity to be around other people, young people that hopefully are spiritually minded, at least have that as a focus enough to be there. And I think that's important. And I think it's good for the encouragement that they give in that as well. And I think there's another opportunity coming up at the East Side congregation in Russellville later on in a few weeks. And so I do want to encourage that. And I'll tell you, I don't want to encourage just the young people to attend those type of events. I want to encourage all of us to be as active as we can in meeting together with brethren in different areas at gospel meetings and different studies that take place, because I really do believe that helps us and encourages us and keeps our focus. Austin talked about in his last invitation about setting our minds on things above and not on things of this earth. And I think if we wanted a theme for 2025, that would be a good one. And those type of activities, the more they're incorporated into our life, the more that they help us to do that. But I am very appreciative for those that made the trip over there yesterday. Hebrews 11 in verse 1 says this, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Depending on what version you're reading from, the wording there may be a little bit different. The substance of things hoped for is kind of the idea of the realization of the things that we are anticipating. And the evidence is the confidence that we have of things that we can't see God, but we're confident that He's there. We don't observe heaven, but we're confident that it's a real place. And that's what faith is. Now, Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 that we need to sanctify the Lord God in our hearts and always be ready to give a defense for everyone who asks a reason for the hope that is within us with meekness and fear. There is a reason why we have that faith. There's a reason why we have that confidence and that assurance and that realization of these things that we can't see. It's not blind faith. It's not just, well, I just wish for that, and so that's what I believe. There are reasons for that. And not only do we need to know what those reasons are, but we should be able to tell others what those reasons are. And those reasons are real, and they can be explained. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about, I think, what is probably some of the most basic, fundamental reasons why we believe in God. And this has twofold. First of all, to remind us not to get caught up in so much of the static that's out there that we forget. And second of all, to give us a reminder of this is what we need to be talking to other people about as well. We need to be reminding them of these reasons. As close as we can come to being sure of anything, it is that we exist. Now, I realize there are some people who are not quite confident that we even exist. Maybe we're some type of computer simulation or something. But I mean, logically, if we can know anything, it's that we exist, that we are here. And from that certainty, we have to start to think about what's the evidence for how we got here. What is it that we could propose to say, yeah, I believe we are here for this reason, because of this. This is how we got to be here. And throughout history, there have been some different theories. And when I say use the word theory, because when you're talking about how something happened in the past, you pretty much have to think of it theoretically, because you can't go back and observe it. So we look at this and say, what did we get here? What the theories that we get here? And there are two basic theories that are widely accepted today. The first is by far the oldest and the most widely accepted throughout history. And that is that we are here because an intelligent being designed and created us and put us here. Now, more recently, in the last couple hundred years, a theory has become a little bit more popular, and that is that we evolved to our present state by chance and by circumstance, and that there's not something else out there that designed and created us. I want to look at these two theories, and I want us to think about it. This first theory, that a living being by wisdom and power and design created us, the theory of creation, that there's some supreme being out there that created the universe, created this earth, created life itself, and this being set all natural laws in order to sustain life so that life could continue. This theory about evolution takes a very different view, because it starts off with that there was nothing, and then at some point out of nothing there was maybe some type of bang that took place, a big bang that took place, that created from nothing something, and these little particles of something, matter, begin to formulate together and collect together in such a way and organize themselves so that we had some type of what we would consider just the universe and stars and planets and so forth. And on one particular planet, the planet that we're most familiar with, Earth, it just so happens that everything was right and conducive for these different non-living molecules to come together and to somehow form life out of non-life. Now, evolutionists will readily admit this is highly improbable. One evolutionist, Howard Morwitz, figured the probability of the formulation of the smallest, simplest living organism is 1 times 10 to the 340 millionth power. In other words, speaking probability, virtually impossible that this could happen. But the theory is, given enough time and enough randomness, that perhaps all of this could fall into place, that there could be life. And from this life, if there's a single cell organism that came from non-life, from that became multi-cell organisms that continue to evolve into something that we would say, for simplification, we will say to fish, and then to amphibians, and then to mammals, and then ultimately to humans. That's how we got here, according to this theory. Just thinking about that, I want us to consider, out of these two theories, which of these would be more plausible? Which of these would be more reasonable as we think about it? Which of these would be more factual? Which of these can we come to some degree of certainty that is true? And let me propose this. Let me propose that when you're trying to decide on something, which is more plausible, which is more reasonable, which is more factual out of theories, that you start with what you already know. Because I don't think that a lot of people, when they're thinking about this, start with what they already know. In John chapter 6, there's an account there that I really has been helpful to me, because Jesus is teaching, and he's teaching some things that are way over everybody's head. And everybody's struggling to understand what he's talking about. He's talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and they're having difficulty understanding. And it says in verse 66 of John 6, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. In other words, this is hard saying. What is he talking about? So Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away also? But Simon Peter answered and said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and to know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter did not say, no, we understand completely what you're talking about, because Peter did not understand what he was talking about. Peter, I'm convinced, is just as confused as everybody else about what Jesus is saying there. But Peter is going to base what he does on what he already knows. And he says, what I know is that you're the Christ and the Son of the living God, and that you have words of life. I don't understand what you're saying right now, but I'm going to stick with what I know. And that was a good decision. That's a good way of going about finding what's right. So what are some things that we are sure of? What are some things that we know? Nothing comes from nothing. Can you think of any exceptions to that? If you start with absolutely nothing, that's what you're always going to have. Something can't come from nothing. We don't know any exceptions to that. And so I know that in the beginning there must have been something, or else there would be nothing now. Here's something else we know. Life comes from pre-existing life. Life always comes from living beings. Now, there was a time where this was in question. There was a theory at one time that was being proposed, and that was spontaneous generation. And that was that there was no life, and then life would just spontaneously generate out of nothing. And one of the bits of evidence that was used to support this theory was maggots. Because possum gets hit on the side of the road, and there's no maggots. But leave him there for 2 days, and maggots seem to spontaneously generate in the carcass of that possum. There you go. Well, there was a scientist, Louis Pasteur, and he began to look. He did not believe that theory, and so he began to disprove that theory. And one of the things that he did to disprove that theory is he took glass jars, and he would put some flesh, some meat in each jar, and one jar he would cover with like cheesecloth, and the other jar he would leave open. And what he was able to show from this is the jar that flies were able to fly into and lay eggs in the meat would develop maggots, the other would not. The maggots were not spontaneously generating. They were coming from the flies. The living flies were depositing eggs that then made living maggots. Life was not spontaneously generating. And so this helped to confirm the theory that life always comes from pre-existing life. And we don't call that a theory anymore. We call that the law of biogenesis. The law of the beginning of life is that it always has to come from pre-existing life. We don't know any exceptions to that. That's the reason why it's a law. A theory is something that may have some evidence to support it, but we don't know it to be true without any exceptions. A law we know to be true without any exceptions. The law of biogenesis is life always comes from pre-existing life. We know that. We know that. Here's something else we know. Things progress from a state of order to disorder, naturally. For something to go from a state of disorder to order, some interference has to take place. Your room, your utility room doesn't go from a state of disorder to a state of order without you intervening and doing something about it. It takes an outside force for that to take place. The way that the universe seems to work is it goes from a state of order and spins down to a state of disorder. If you take a brand new car and you park it out in the woods and you leave it for 300 years, that car is not going to continue to evolve with whatever the latest technology is. As a matter of fact, 300 years later, it will be in good shape if it looks like that. It's gone from being new to a state of disorder. And if you leave that out there for 300 years, it's not going to evolve to be a functioning automobile. It'll turn completely to dust. The second law of thermodynamics, scientists call it entropy, is where things go from a state of order to a state of disorder. It runs downhill unless something intervenes. If something intervenes, then it can go from a state of disorder to order, but not on its own. It has an outside force that is involved in that. Now, this is just a few things that we know. Why don't we just take a few things that we know for sure and draw the best conclusion that we can about things that we can't observe, like how we got here? So, which of these theories fit better with what we know? Evolution, that everything comes from nothing, that life comes from non-life, that there's a progression of disorder to order, or creation, that everything we see today came from something that's always existed, that life came from a living being, that this being created order, and as with all things, this order is changing to disorder. Romans chapter 1 in verse 20 says this. Romans 1 in verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. What does Paul say? Paul is saying when you look around today, you can see the things that exist today, and from that you can draw conclusions about how these things got here. You can even understand something about God from the things that he made. You can even understand his eternal power and his Godhead. We can't go back and see how everything came to be as it is today, but we can understand what happened by looking at what we do have today. The unseen is seen by what is before us today. So what can we see? What is observable to us today? Well, we already said life is observable to us. We see it everywhere. We see human life. We see animal life. We see plant life. Life is abundant. Intelligence, design, everything. From the macro level of the entire cosmos and universe down to the micro level of the smallest thing we've been able to detect in an atom, a particle. We see design in everything. Everything. Which theory fits better with what we can see? Evolution? That life spontaneously generated from non-life, that intelligence developed from nothing, that random design formed out of chaos, or creation, that the life that we see came from a living being, the intelligence that we observe came from an intelligent being, that the design that we see came from a designer. Certainly one theory fits better with what we can observe. And if you just start with that, it's not surprising that throughout history, this idea that a living being by wisdom and power designed and created has been the dominant theory throughout human history. That just makes sense. That's just logical as we go through it. Let me try to illustrate this. Some of you have heard me use this illustration before. Let's suppose that we're walking out in the woods and we come across this. And we see this just out in the middle of the woods. How did this object come into existence? One could propose the theory that it evolved there by chance. Let me try to do that. So we're looking at this object. And as we look at this object, we notice the glass on the front and the sides. Now, what do we know about glass? Well, glass is formed by superheating sand and cooling it. And you know what? That happens naturally. You can find where lightning has struck sand before and formed it into glass. Here's a picture of it. It looks something like that. That happens naturally. Suppose that millions of years ago, lightning struck sand in this area, formed it into that. Over the hundreds of thousands of years since, wind erosion, water erosion, formed that glass into what we see on the front and sides of this object. It took time, but it could happen. Rubber is formed by rubber trees in tropical regions. Maybe this is not a tropical region now, but 100 million years ago, perhaps it was. And maybe rubber trees were growing here. And they got covered up. And over the years, through time and pressure, they formed these good years on this vehicle or this object that we're looking at. And we observe that this object has metal on it. Well, how is metal formed? Well, you start off with iron ore. And when iron ore is heated and combined with other elements, it forms a metal. And maybe, enough time, the iron ore that is present in this area, maybe it was superheated, maybe by lightning, maybe by other forces, forming this metal. And through time and pressure and erosion and so forth, it formed this sheet metal body that we have on this vehicle. Are those plausible arguments? Are they probable arguments? They're not probable. All of us would say, I don't think that's what happened here. That's not what took place here. And why would you say that? Well, because there's a much simpler explanation. There's a much better, a much more plausible explanation. There's a more logical explanation. And then you would point out things like, if you were to open the hood of this, what you would see is you would see an engine there, and you would see that with this there are hundreds of parts that are machined to precision to work together. Incredible design, and it functions together. Functions in such a way as to even create energy, power, motion of this vehicle. Surely that didn't happen by random chance. And then you would look at the electrical system where there are hundreds of wires carefully placed and connected so that they work together, and electrical impulses can run through those wires and cause this vehicle to do a lot of different things. Lights can turn on. Alarms can sound. Even going to these rubber tires. It doesn't look like they were a random accident. It looks like they were specifically designed for a purpose. You see those grooves, that tread that's cut in there? It looks like that was specifically designed for the purpose of making contact and holding contact to a surface for traction. So if all of us went out in the woods and found this object, I doubt that any one of us would say, yeah, I think it evolved here. Logically, we would all come, we don't know who built it. We don't know who the engineers were. We don't know who the manufacturer was, but we know there was one. There's too much evidence to support the fact that there is a designer and a creator of this object. Now, you look at this object, and then you compare it to this object, and do you know which one is far more complex? Oh, the human body is so much more complex in every way. You take the different systems. You take the digestive system. Talk about the engine of a car being able to take some type of fuel and convert it into energy. Whoa. We have these different organs in our bodies that can take all different types of fuel sources and convert them into energy. You look at the nervous system of the human body. Incredible. Miles of nerves with nerve endings that are able to feel even the slightest senses and to process that information, make sense of that information, and respond appropriately to all different types of environments. Talk about design in the human body, in every cell. Talking about tires looking like they were designed for traction. Look at your end of your fingers. You've got tread built in right there. Tread that can repair. When tires wear out, you have to throw them away. When the tread on your fingertips wear out, you know what happens? It regrows. It can heal. It can repair itself. Far more complex. It is not logical to look at man and to say that he evolved. Just as it's not logical to look at a vehicle out in the middle of the woods and say it evolved. There's too much design there must be a designer. Now, let me say this. I don't know how to understand or to answer all the things that scientists think they know about the age of the universe or the origin of life or all of those things. But that doesn't mean I have to dismiss the things that I do know. And I think this is the key where we're at. We get to the point where we say, well, somebody who has a lot more education than I do says it's this way. I guess it's that way. Don't throw out what you know just because someone who does know a lot says something. My belief in a supreme being who created all things is not based upon things that I cannot see and don't understand. It's based upon what I can see and I do understand. Let me say that again, because this is true for you too. Your understanding of why God exists is not based upon things that you cannot see and don't understand. It's based upon what you do see and you do understand. The reason you believe there's a designer is because you see design. The reason you believe there's a living, powerful being out there that created all things is because you see living beings and you know they had to come from a living being. So going back to Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. You believe in an unseen God because of the creation that you do see. So when someone asks you, what's the reason you believe in God? So we'll look around. What do you see? What's the plausible explanation for how that got here? In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, he said, they are without excuse. And I really do believe that that's true. I believe that anyone who denies that there is a God is without excuse because the evidence, I believe, is overwhelming for that. So when we talk about the reason for the hope that is within us, and we talk about faith being the evidence, the confidence that we have in the unseen, that's based upon something that we do see. Let me mention something else. I don't believe that there's any excuse for not recognizing there's a creator, which also leads to the conclusion that we have some accountability to him. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, for those who come to him must believe that he is and that he's the rewarder of those that diligently seek him. That's the natural progression that takes place. God has given us enough evidence that we can observe with our eyes and our ears and our senses to know that he exists. And that should lead us down the train of thought of saying, well, what's my relationship there? What's my responsibility to him? Now, we're not going into that in this lesson, but let me end this lesson by simply saying, don't ever let the static of the world around us confuse you on what you can see and what you can know. And then think deeply about that regarding how you should respond. And so as we end this lesson, I know that if not all of us, most of us in this room believe that there's a God and believe that we're accountable to God. I hope this morning we've gone back to the very fundamentals and just kind of anchored ourselves. And once again, yeah, that really is true. That's real. Now, how should I be responding to that? And then as we are together and encouraging each other, let the encouragement of those around you cause you to respond in faithfulness, in loyalty, in obedience to the Creator. This morning, if we can help you in that, please come while we stand, while we sing. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.